What's going on, guys? Welcome to another YouTube video. This time we're doing another Remnant 2 challenge run where we can't use any armor or trinkets, which means that we will have 0 scaling throughout the entirety of this game, which is just gonna make certain events very fun. One thing to note before we start this run is that my class I have chosen for this run are going to be Gunslinger and Hunter. Once again, I know, very intuitive. And that about halfway through a quarter of the way through this run, I changed my weapon from the base one to the Black Maw, which is because I think the Black Maw is just overall one of the most powerful guns in the game. But without further ado, let's get right into the video. Now our first encounter in Yisha is going to be the Pixie. This event isn't all too interesting, however it is an overworld encounter, so I included it. You either get Barkskin or some other one, I think it's like Great Health Regeneration Rate or something like that. Either way, it's not too useful, as because we can't take any hits without dying, it's not that great. Moving on to our first actual dungeon though, we encounter the Imperial Gardens, everyone's favorite place. As per usual, the Imperial Gardens is very obnoxious. It's big, it's long, and it's also a puzzle dungeon, which just means I have to run around the entire map to figure it out. One weird thing to note is that Mantigora, the boss of this dungeon, rolled a teleporter, which I didn't realize he could, and for whatever reason he kept teleporting back and forth between this one section, which made it significantly easier to kill him. But, I mean, I'll count my blessings, because this is the first time the Imperial Gardens wasn't actually annoying to get through. Once he's out of the way, I quickly make my way around the map, figure out the puzzle, so that way I can grab the reward and we can move on. Which leads us straight to Kayla's Shadow. Now this particular boss isn't too interesting, as it's just basically just a bigger version of some of those elites you encounter in the overworld. He does relatively same thing, although once you get him to a low enough health, he will burrow on the ground and summon a bunch of tentacles to attack you, which can be a little scary if you're not careful. However, the most noteworthy thing about this boss is the fact that he spawned with elemental resist, which means that my hotshot winds up being less damage than more damage, which just makes the entire fight way more annoying than it needs to be. Now, as with most challenge runs, each one of them have their own little wrinkle that makes it the challenge even more difficult than it normally would be, and for this particular one, it's going to be ammo. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I swapped from my base weapon to the Black Maw AR just because I think it's versatile enough to be useful in almost every situation, which I find to be more valuable than anything else right now. However, until I get to the later stages of the games where my class will be able to carry me a little more, I'm going to be constantly running out of ammo on most bosses, and this one is no different. It's not that big of an issue right now, as it's still early in the game, so we are able to make our way through without too much issue, but this will become a problem in later fights. Moving on to the Expanding Glade, we have a quick little puzzle we have to get through before we get to the boss, which is just this little elevator puzzle, where we take it to the top, grab the chest, then we take it back down, where we then re-trigger it so that way we can find the code for the secret area underneath, and then we're able to move on to the boss Shrewd. Now, Shrewd is honestly up there with one of the easiest bosses in the game, as he's just a glorified archer, and the only scary part about him is when he summons his adds, which they spawn out of pods, but they die to one shot from mostly anything, so the AR is able to take it down very easily and keep control of the situation. He didn't spawn with any sort of defensive buffs either, so the fight wasn't too long. So as long as you keep a move on, this boss won't cause you any troubles, and we are able to get through him on our first try. Next up on our list is the chimney. But before we get to the end of the chimney, there is a quick little area you have to go through with the glass eyes. This one's not too complicated, you just shoot the eyes and it opens up a secret elevator. It does trap you in a room with a creepy fallen angel type enemy, but I mean, it's not too crazy, and it's not a lot of them, it's only 1 or 2. So we do that real fast, and then we make it to the actual event, which is just this crazy spiral staircase, which you've got to follow this crystal down. You can't go too fast or too slow, otherwise it'll kill you. Now, for my first time, I was dumb and didn't really know how this event worked, and it really confused me at first, which was why it gave me such a hard time. But once you know what you're doing, all you have to do is make sure you don't fall for any of the traps, and you keep the hordes that are following you in check, and make sure you don't take too long so that elites don't give you a problem, and you'll be fine. We do this and make our way to the bottom floor very easily, and we're able to do this in 1 try. No problem. Moving on to our last dungeon before the world boss of Yisha is the Lament, which is just another giant puzzle dungeon. Now, typically on my normal runs at this point, I just skip the Lament. It's not all that interesting, and it's quite annoying, honestly, with a bunch of instant death traps if you mess up. But basically, all you have to do is make it through this maze of arrows, which we do very easily, as you can just crouch under most of them. As long as you're careful and you don't have any elevation, they'll fly right over you, no problem. Then we quickly make our way through the dungeon, so that way we can get to the primary focus of this dungeon, which is just this little puzzle, which we implement very easily as well, opening that door. And honestly, the biggest issue of this dungeon was the secret side dungeon, where we had to fight a mini-boss that for some reason just kept coming downstairs into the water, and if you fight this boss in the water, I'm pretty sure you just lose if you can't kill him in time. Which obviously in this particular run, damage is not a luxury we have, so we die. And the most annoying part is that not only was he running downstairs, but also other enemies were spawning downstairs as well. There were bombers and elites also causing me problems, and it took me several times for me to even make it to the stairs before he did, so that way I could actually dodge some of his attacks. This particular event was very frustrating at first, but we do eventually manage to get lucky enough to where he would just stay in place until I got into a better position, and then we're able to finish him off after that. With that out of the way, the only thing left in this area is Culkin's Key and the secret armor set with the saw blades. Both of these are just very easy to get through, and we do both of those, and then we're able to move on to the final boss. Now for this particular run, we got the Corruptor rather than the Ravager, and if I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, this boss was the main reason why this took me so long to get done. This is not a particularly difficult boss, however it is very obnoxious. The primary issue was just the fact that it took so long to deal any meaningful damage that I would either make a mistake or I would die to birds or something stupid would happen. On top of the fact that this boss spawned as Regenerator and Hardy, double defense, and it's also a boss that you can't deal a lot of damage to until it's in its weaker phase, which is just reviving its ally. And it just, by the time I was in a position to deal any damage, he would have healed all the damage that I dealt previously. And it was just a nightmare of me just dying over and over again. And eventually, I had to just call it for a little bit. Like, honestly, it broke me. It really did. It was so obnoxious, and there was really nothing I could do about it. But eventually I did come back, and I took another look at the boss, and I did have an idea. Consumables are never banned in my runs for this very reason, as I might need them. They might become crucial to make anything work. And this is a perfect example of how crucial some of those consumables can be. The primary issue is that even if I got good enough to dodge this boss for 30 minutes, I would still make zero progress because he was regenerating too much. Now, there is a consumable in the game that applies bleeding, and bleeding is very important because it reduces healing by 50%. Utilizing these pipe bombs when Micah came back, I was able to actually maybe make some progress. Utilizing this new strategy, I still died. However, it was progress. Now, using a combination of the pipe bombs and the mysterious mist, I was actually able to make some decent progress that way. This boss was such a pain. It took me so long, and when I finally beat him with this rule set, I was so happy. But I couldn't have done it without these two consumable items. With the Corruptor out of the way, we were able to quickly make our way through the Labyrinth. As the Labyrinth never changes, it's not too interesting, and we utilize our same strategies we always do, and we're able to make it through the Siege Survival event fairly easily. It does get a little close for comfort every now and then, as our damage is very low, as always. However, it's not too difficult in the end, and we're able to make our way through it, leaving us with the Cube Boss. And as normally, the Cube Boss is in this little gray area of being very difficult if you don't know what you're doing, but very easy if you do. It winds up being not too big of a problem. As recently I had to do this in a melee-only run, I know this boss pretty much inside and out, and since I know all of their patterns, the only thing I need to be concerned about are the orbs they shoot from above that can be very obnoxious and the Wall of Death. Keeping both of these in mind, I'm able to very easily make my way through this entire section. The Black Maw AR is very versatile and very powerful, so that way we can grab the biome portal key and make our way to our next planet, which winds up being Losum. Now, it's also the version of Losum where you need the magic feather, so we have to first quickly make our way through the entire castle to the Jester, watch his little show, grab the feather, and then we can start knocking these dungeons out of the way. And our first dungeon of Losum winds up being the Great Hall. The Great Hall is quite obnoxious and is actually a really big problem for a run like this, as I'm lacking in both healing and damage. I constantly am just running out of health via the damage over time effect, and I just do not have the time on my side to be able to make it through this event without a little help. This particular run is really starting to look like it's a run dedicated to more consumables than anything else, but I do what I do to make it through. Utilizing an elixir of root water, I am able to use its regeneration effects to barely be able to survive by the skin of my teeth, and we were able to just make it. Thank goodness, because I would have hated to have to wait to the very end of the campaign to do this event again. Next up is the Butcher's Quarters, but before we make it to the end of this dungeon, we have a quick side area that we need to slink off to where we have to watch out for a bunch of birds that'll peck us to death if we're not careful. We quickly make our way through that, grab the box, and then we move on to the end of this dungeon. As per the rules of this run, the end of the dungeon requires us to save him, as because that's the fight, and this particular event is actually not that bad this time. The AR is very, very good at dealing with crowds of enemies, as well as dealing solid single target DPS if you're able to keep the beam on them long enough. Due to our weapon choice and mod options, we are able to very handedly and calmly take this event down, saving our boy once more and not letting him burn this time. Now, once we're done with the Butcher's Quarters, it leads us straight into the Shattered Gallery, which is actually a very good encounter for us. We do first have to make our way through the dungeon and do this little side area where we have to change the fires. We choose blue this time for no reason in particular, just because I like the color blue. And we move on to Master Dolan. No, not Dolan, Dolan. I got made fun of for that in the previous video. The only thing to take note of about this boss in particular is just how bulky he is. He's not very hard, as all of his attacks are very slow or very projectile based. And as long as you just don't corner yourself and get overwhelmed, it's not too much of a problem. However, ammo is a problem. This is one of the few fights where ammo just was never in good supply, and even on my winning attempt on this boss, I pretty much ended the fight with no ammo. Although it is good that we got through this fight and we got this encounter, because this lets us have access to Corrosion Shot, which I think is just the best mod in the game if you're going for guns. Now, there are two more encounters we have to get through before we get to the world boss of this world, one of them being the Huntress and the other one being Bloat King and the Great Sewers. However, I will be entirely honest with you guys, the footage I got of those fights got corrupted and I couldn't use it. So instead, here's a picture of a cat. Finally, we move on to Feyron, the last boss of Losum. And this fight is, in particular, fairly difficult if I'm being honest. Now, a few things to take note about this boss is that for some reason, corrosion is very strong against him. I'm not 100% certain why, all I know is that the corrosion shot in particular is very, very strong. And doubly so even against Feyron, as it seems to just eat straight through his armor really fast. But the main problem with this fight is that his later phases just take a long time. With this corrosion shot, even though we are lacking severely in damage, the fact that corrosion works so well against him lets us burn through his early phases really fast. However, his third phase and even his last phase where he goes intangible are just very, very difficult as they're very long. And one mistake sets us all the way back to the end, and our time to deal damage is very, very small in his last phase. I do die quite a few times trying to relearn this fight, as it's been a little bit since I fought Feyron. Normally I get the Dreamweaver. Abusing the fact that corrosion just does massive damage to him, we are able to eventually take him down, despite the fact that it takes a long time. Moving on to our final planet, Shrewd, I have a confession to make. Shrewd isn't really my favorite planet. If I'm being honest, it's my least favorite planet, which is why I'm going to take this pretty fast, just because it's boring in my opinion. It's a very dreary looking planet. So we move on to the Vault of the Formless, which is just a siege event. It's not too difficult. The only issue you could have is having flying enemies sneak up behind you or hitting you through the floor. But other than that, it's a pretty easy event. I do take the alternate route and grab the bonus objective before leaving the area, and then we get to the end, take out the last elite, and this event is done without too much issue. Moving on to our next event is the hatchery. This is a very commonplace event, and there is nothing too interesting in this area either, so we were able to quickly make our way to the boss of this area, the Primogenitor, who is the easiest boss in the game in my opinion. I've stated this multiple times. He still has nothing very interesting to go off of, and a lot of his attacks don't actually even kill you. They apply a debuff, which will kill you, but it takes too long to stack up. So, other than the fact that it is scaled pretty well, and he's got a defensive perk on his side, this fight just takes a long time, but it's not necessarily that difficult. We're able to get through on our first try without too much issue. Moving on, we make it to the Spectrum Nexus, which means that we'll be fighting Custodian Eye. Ugh, great. But before we get there, there is one thing we have to do. There's this little parkour section where we have to defeat a guaranteed elite spawn and then make our way down to the bottom floor, where then we also have to touch this little purple, bluey, glowy thingy, and it takes us to the easiest elite fight in the game. There's nothing much to say about this guy. He's doesn't have any new abilities. He's just one of those bomber guys with way more health than normal. It takes a while, but it's not difficult, and we're able to make it through. With that out of the way, we do make our way through the end of this dungeon, which winds up being Custodian Eye, as I said before, and this boss is actually kind of really difficult. Now, I don't know if this boss was difficult per se as because he was actually a difficult boss, or more because I'm bad, but I just kept having so many problems with this guy, whether he be spawning his laser on top of me just getting unlucky, or my guy literally committing suicide by jumping off the cliff because he wants to for some reason. There were just too many things going wrong, and it was really frustrating. However, I have had to deal with frustrating bosses before, and my perseverance will not fail me this time. I already beat the Corruptor, who is way more annoying than this guy, so all it takes is a couple more tries, and me not being bad, and figuring out the proper positioning for this fight, and we are able to make our way through it. Since our boss of this week is going to be Talrotha, I do need to make a quick pit stop to grab those soul sparks, and then we're off to our final dungeon, which winds up being the Dormant Nerudian facility. Now this is actually quite a fun event. I enjoy this one a lot because there's two ways you can do it, but ever since I found out the faster way of doing it, I typically just go and do the manual override. It's never really a problem, and it's completing the event, which is not breaking any of our rules. However, there is a weird interaction with the elite that spawns, where he spawns as Disruptor, and he shoots his rockets and then teleports me, and the teleportation is what kills my character. I'm not too sure what happened here because I thought I dodged the rockets, but unfortunately we lose this opportunity, and I guess it's technically a fail, but I feel a little cheated here. Regardless, we have to move on. Now onto the final boss of Shrewd is Talrotha, who is one of my favorite encounters in the entire planet, if I'm being honest with you. It's just a very interesting boss, and I always enjoy being able to have a conversation with the boss before I have to fight them. Same thing with the Ravager, I always enjoyed fighting him too. But Talrotha isn't too complicated of a boss, especially since we are using the AR. Utilizing our Hot Shot and our AR, we are able to deal with most of his options. Utilizing his summons and his little orbs, we're able to take them down fairly easily, as the AR specialty is dealing consistent damage to groups. Other than those two summons, none of his attacks are very, very difficult to dodge, although you will have to be careful of his area slam attack, as that got me one time. Other than that, the only other concern would be running out of ammo, which does happen. However, at this point in time, we've got plenty of pickups and ammo boxes to see us through to the end. After a few more minutes of shooting, we do manage to take this behemoth down, and we're able to move on to the final area. Moving on to the final planet, Rude Earth, we are able to quickly make our way to our first event, the Siege Survival. Now, I don't know what was going on, but I was apparently on my A game. Typically, the Root Manti would give me some trouble, as they are just very, very scary enemies, but this time they didn't. Utilizing both Hot Shot and my Gunslinger abilities, I'm able to quickly take them down, and after that, the Root Knight isn't really that scary as long as you've got the timing down, and we're able to get through him as well without many problems. that was a first try, and I'm very happy with our progress. Moving on immediately afterwards to Cancer is another really fun and easy area. Now, Cancer is one of my favorite fights personally. However, this one in particular was very weird, as his spires despawned, and then they started just spawning ammo constantly. And it got to a point where I was scared my game was gonna crash, so I tried my best to either reset the fight or just win as fast as possible. It was very bizarre, but it didn't change the fight significantly, as the strategy doesn't change. We just stick very close to him and abuse the fact that he's very slow to maximize our damage, and we are able to make our way through it. Moving on to the next section of this area is not necessarily a siege survival or a boss event, however it is a very long stretch chocked full of very tough elites and lots of enemies that gave me a lot of problems this time. Now, I just had a very hard time dealing enough damage to actually make it through these guys, as the Strider's main gimmick is that they spawn hordes of enemies. Typically this is a problem, but as we're lacking damage, by the time I killed one set of enemies, they were already ready to spawn another one, so I had to develop a strategy of leaving one or two alive, just so that way I could put some damage on the baddies before they would spawn their next group. This strategy kind of worked, but every single time I would get to the next area, it would still just be too much, as two of them, plus every once in a while I would accidentally trigger the night too early, and it would just spell my doom pretty much immediately. I eventually had to develop another strategy of keeping one alive so that way they wouldn't spawn their next group, along with the fact of just making sure to be sneaky and only triggering one at a time to the best of my capabilities. And that little extra bit is actually what let us get to the end, as I was able to take down one Strider, then the next, and then take the knight down when he was all alone. Which is good, because our next area is the next siege survival event I like to call Stairs. Now, usually this area is pretty simple, as you can just use this choke of holding the stairs and they all have to walk up slowly to get to you. But our lack of DPS came to really bite us in the butt in this particular area, as not even holding this choke point is good enough since we can't kill the enemies fast enough. We do manage to make it through utilizing our skills properly and our mods, but it is quite close, as the normal enemies actually manage to make it up the stairs, and then the mantis follows them up without me doing any significant damage to it, which was a little worrisome. But we do manage to make it through, and we are able to make it to the final boss before Annihilation, Venom. Now, Venom is typically quite the obnoxious boss, as not many of his attacks are super threatening. However, he does have two attacks in particular that give me a lot of problems, and that's going to be his overhead slam attack that gives you very little time to react to it, and his orbs of doom that he shoots out that for some reason almost crash my game every time he tosses them. But regardless of this, he doesn't actually spawn with too many annoying modifiers, which means that our hotshot is actually going to be very useful here, and I actually am able to get through this guy on our first try. He was very kind in not using his overhead attack too many times, and the fact that I only ran out of ammo at one point, I quickly used an ammo box to fix that problem, and we're able to make our way through this boss on our first try. Which is very cool considering this boss is typically pretty annoying. Once again, we make it to the end. Annihilation once more. Annihilation is also a fantastic final boss for this game. A huge improvement from the first game, and I always enjoy my time fighting this boss. Now, this boss in particular is very, very annoying, this version of him at least, because he spawned with elemental resist, which means that this entire fight is going to be done without any mod assistance. Now, this is scary for two reasons. One is because this boss has two phases, and in his second phase he takes even less damage than normal, which is going to make this fight take forever, once again. And two, his second phase is going to just be very difficult to get through with his orbs and all of that sort of stuff. Now, this fight did take me a considerable amount of time to get through, as a single mistake meant instant death, and it was just a very long and very endurance-based fight. It was just a matter of, could I dodge enough attacks and shoot long enough to actually even make it through to the end of this fight. There weren't any real consumables that would help me, nor were there any sort of damage increases that I could utilize. So it was just a matter of being good and being able to outlast the boss. I ran out of ammo several times. I even had to go back to Ward 13 to grab more ammo boxes, which is how many times I ran out of ammo during this fight. On top of the fact that halfway through the fight, for some reason, the visual effect for the lightning strikes in its second phase just stopped working, which is really fun for me to find out the hard way. And it was just a very long and it was just a slog. The AR, I still believe, was the right choice for this entire run, as its utility is very good. It's decent damage, it was able to deal with the orbs, and its ammo was actually not as bad as I believe other weapons would have been. However, it still relies heavily on the fact that we need to do our job of not dying, and after a few more trials, we are able to actually make it to the end. And it is very possible to beat Remnant 2 with no gear and no trinkets. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next challenge. Adios, boys.